So no matter where you are in your drawing skill level, how well you can draw, you can always better implement the principles of design that lead to better characters. So if you're unfamiliar with the critique format, we've changed things up the last few times. These are all submissions made by folks like you over on patreon.com/bageldenizen at the novice bard tier. And all of these folks that you'll see in the video today have A, opted in for their work to be shown publicly. That isn't necessarily something that you need to do. And B, they've already gotten their own video where I've talked to them personally. This is me just using their work to help you learn more about character design. Also on Patreon is the Biko's Backpack tier, just one tier up from the Novice Bard tier. That's where you get a package in the mail every month with new original art from me. And I wanted to kind of show off or preview one of the things coming in next month's, but because of the green screen behind me, this is an illustration of Biko, and so he would be basically transparent through that. You're running out of time. If you want to get in on January's Biko's Backpack, you have up until January 31st to do so. And of course, the Lamb of Liberation tier above that is where you get everything that's on Patreon. Of course, everything on Patreon, you get everything below that tier, plus what's in the tier. So a custom commission at the Lamb of Liberation tier, plus the Biko's Backpack, plus the personal critique. I don't know how you could go wrong with that. So there's three folks in today's video. We have Blake, Sahad, and Sophia, all in different places in their drawing skills, their drawing experience. But I want to show you how with each of them we can use these principles: proportion, balance, segmentation, weight within their characters. Some of these things involve improving your drawing skills in order to better implement these things, but still the principles of design, they're a different aspect. They're different from drawing. It's all about decision making and ultimately communicating through design. Character design is so complicated because we're trying to do so many things at once. We're trying to keep our characters grounded and empathetic and make it so that they can express well, but we also want them to be exciting, maybe exaggerated. So using these things, we'll be able to find that mix depending on what our goal is. So we're starting off with Blake here. Here's a few examples of his work. And the main thing that I wanted Blake to focus on is not necessarily those principles of design, but rather the drawing skills that come from learning construction. One thing that I do kind of note with his work here is that you have a lot of inconsistency with some of the shapes. The shapes are sort of laying over top of one another, almost like paper cutouts. We lose that illusion of depth in certain places, right? Ideally we would have any kind of indentation or line that's indicating something like the sleeve here to show, not only just the wrinkle of the shirt, but that kind of cylindrical form or contour line around that. And we also have a lot of things like inconsistency across maybe proportions or legs. We have areas like sort of a lack of a pelvis in some of these areas where we just kind of have legs next to each other. So not necessarily looking at those aspects of design, but through using construction, which you'll see I kind of added a couple of things for him to work on here, you get dimension, right? You get consistency, and you also get that sense of depth. You see here kind of toggling the changes made here by knowing that there's a finite length of a segment of a constructed shape. Even if it is just sort of simple cylinders, you are able to kind of put things in the right place. You know where something is going to go mirrored on the other side of it. But another aspect, kind of more to our purpose of thinking about shapes and the proportions of things and segmenting things, is you notice that we get sort of this torso shape or this t-shirt shape here. It's a lot of material, right? It's sort of ambiguous, and there are places where something like this is maybe a good idea as far as design goes. I think of kind of the old animated Batman, where there's a version of him that's essentially just a silhouette, right? Because he's got sort of this, let me just do it real quick. You have his head that's then just, the rest of him is this cape wrapped completely around him. And so all we have is this one large black shape. And it's good from the standpoint of it's somewhat ambiguous. So you have this stoic character of Batman, and it also inspires that kind of fear that goes along with the character. It makes some sense. You do still kind of have some of these lines, though, unless he's completely in shadow, that kind of break up the shape a little bit. Something that I said to Sahad in his critique is that usually with something like this where you have these large spaces of the same color or same material, the same shapes, right? Usually you're trying to indicate an amount of scale, right? So, you have a giant creature that, has this big back here and everything. Maybe this, you have a really tiny character down here. That indicates, okay, this character's so large that the same ideas keep going on for a long time. And even then, I'd still try to break things up with some amount of scaling or detail or spotting, something like that, right? But what does tend to happen, though, outside of these kind of ideas, is that things get too monotonous, right? We have here really something that's kind of too ambiguous in this shape here, when really it'd be nice if we had those dimensional forms, right? And a better understanding of the actual body of the character, rather than just sort of being draped with this one large t-shirt. We lose a lot. So something that can help here, beyond just the construction, is better segmenting, right? Something that adds either just, whether it's a collar or a sleeve or something, or a stripe of color, or even a graphic could help a little bit. This kind of shows the value of improving your skills in order to give yourself more tools to work with, more things that you're able to do and express through your drawing. Through learning construction here, you'd be able to have a better understanding of not only how your characters are shaped, how to move them, but then more things can be added onto those constructed shapes. You can sculpt on top of that armature. We're moving forward now to Sahad, who sent along a large body of work for a game that he's working on, I'm assuming in sort of the style of a visual novel. A lot of his characters have additional animations and a little bit of movement that goes with each of them. And there's a few things. We've moved forward in artistic skill and experience a little bit from our previous examples, although there are some art fundamental things that I think would definitely help in Sahad's case. For our purposes here, I want to talk about dynamic proportions and segmentation, which isn't really something we usually think about when it comes to dynamic things, right? Dynamic energy, dynamic posing, or some kind of exaggerated or extreme shapes or something. What we're actually going to look at here is a lot to do with the clothing choices and the sort of fashion design, clothing design of your characters, and how that can help a lot. And a few things as far as anatomy is concerned as well. So let me just kind of pull up, let me toggle here just some of the changes that I made anatomically, mainly for these two characters on the right here. A few things as far as the head is concerned, right? We have the sort of oblong nature of the skull here. Another thing here with this character on the right was the sort of the nature. Obviously my head got a little bit larger there, but we see the head is sort of this teardrop shape here, and ideally what we want to do is build on the back of the skull here, rough little line there, and then also kind of bring the jaw forward. So that's where the nose and the teeth and everything are. So that was the main thing that we worked on there. But a couple other things as far as anatomy with these two characters. We have a little bit more flow, right? What I kind of gathered initially from this character on the left is he looks a little bit like the everyman, kind of like the Star-Lord kind of being inserted, or audience surrogate character who isn't necessarily as heroic as we might like. I don't know Sahad's specific purpose for this character, but I wanted to work with him along the lines of, what if this was a more heroic looking character? One of the things that you'll notice that I did was all of the anatomy changes here are obviously more dynamic. We have a stronger kind of flow to a lot of these shapes, and that helps a lot with that dynamic idea and proportion that we're talking about. Some of the things that are happening here are, you have in the clothing some segmenting, right? You have this the sleeves that cut off at a point that looks a little bit more like a t-shirt than it would a tunic or a warrior's outfit. A lot of the shapes are kind of square, and they're cutting at a point that aren't necessarily doing this character favors, right? As far as any kind of masculine look goes. The green tunic here also, there's a bit of inconsistency with the way that the fabric is hanging by the time it gets to the belt versus what it does past the belt, right? Where it's kind of flaring out into that kind of plumage, I suppose. I don't think that the fabric necessarily would drape that way or go out that way due to gravity, right? So a few things that I did, first of all, I actually pulled up some reference of similar medieval looking tunics because actually when you think about it, fashion designers, garment costume designers, they're actually working with a lot of the same principles that we are with construction. You're starting with those flat shapes, flat fabric, and using lines and contours and cuts and stitches and things in order to shape around and add some amount of meaning to these things. So for example, you'll notice here that this tunic here, this green one, there's these very simple lines that run down that do something, right? They break up the shapes within this character. It adds segments. The same with the belt there. I like also what's kind of happening with these sleeves here. We have what would normally be sort of 2 arm segments there being split up into 3, and I think it adds a little bit more excitement and stuff. We also have, I like these 2 examples here, just because there's very simple things happening that add sort of that extra strength to the outfits. So those were some of the things that I used with this character, but you'll also notice that the places where some of these lines go tend to lend to a more dynamic look for the character, and some of that is trial and error, and some of it is just understanding where to add your segments, where to add a little bit of a shape at the end of a sleeve, right? This is along those same lines of the large giant character with this big massive shape to them, but also adding a little bit of detail. We're getting into the idea of balance at that point. With human anatomy, we have a lot of S-curves, calls and responses, where things tend to balance out. And so when we start a large idea in character design, it's often really helpful to add in these little visual breaks and things that are kind of curving back in the other direction. We have a really large sleeve here that isn't being broken up necessarily. Of course, when he starts to move his arms and bend them and everything, then they start to kind of segment out a little bit. But as far as the actual garment is concerned, we're now finishing it off with this tiny shape. We're using a large shape and then a small one to cap it off. So now we've worked our way all the way up to Sophia, who's kind of at this end of the artistic skill spectrum where I have no doubt that she's capable of doing the things that are suggested here. So it's almost like we're working with pure design principles and making those decisions that lead to better looking characters, better storytelling, and those purposes. I really like Sophia's work. She has a lot of goals pertaining to telling some visual stories, directing short films and animated features and things like that. And you get a sense with these characters that they can do that. They're capable of those things. But a few changes, a few things that I wanted to kind of just help her get to that next level. There's a few things like this character here, where there's a lot of really great shapes and everything to the character, but a few things that add, I think, some extra amount of character, right? A little bit more personality, are the length of these sleeves. Thinking about getting into the mind of this character, this age, right? And the personality of someone at that point. If we're trying to push into a kind of more mischievous point with this character, I think that hitting that sort of 8-9-year-old girl range with sleeves that are a lot longer, you have a lot of good character moment type things that can happen, maybe where she starts kind of wiping her face with the long sleeve. They're too long for her, so she's kind of trying to shake them back into place. But it also is that idea of these are kind of now a little bit more exaggerated things that are added onto the character, makes them a little bit more larger than life. But you also have these segments, right? There's a little bit of a banding at the end of the sleeve. Pretty similar idea as what we were working on with the tunic there. But it just breaks up a larger shape with a smaller one, and you get that balance. Something else that I wanted Sophia to kind of try and work on is to start with one large overall shape, one large silhouette, and chip away at that, find those segments and calls and responses to establish the character. I think that would have maybe benefited this character here, who there's a few different kind of iterations of here. I think that maybe if maybe you start with this very asymmetrical hairstyle here, and you work your way up to maybe kind of like a character who almost looks a little bit like a turnip, where everything's kind of working its way into, and then all of a sudden becomes just, it sprouts out at the top with the hair, right? Or something where those same curls or the same braids here kind of have some kind of echo somewhere in a different place in the character, further down the body of the character. This is another great design of Sophia's here that I just kind of went a little bit crazy adding some things to change. I really like the shape of the legs and things like that. This jacket, this big jacket, is kind of the largest shape that we're working with, but there's a little bit that's too ambiguous about it. We have the large shape, but there's no sort of call and response to it. One thing that helps there is maybe just this little kind of band, that little fringe around the bottom of the coat that establishes and grounds it a little bit. A couple other things like the placement of the strap here, and adding, you know, the smallest little tuning keys there. I think that's the right thing, the right word for a guitar or ukulele, in order to establish that that's what that is more immediately, instead of kind of leaving it up for interpretation. Placement of the cap, right? The way that it rests on the head, just a little bit further back based on the nature of the skull. But ultimately, some small things that all come down to what's going to make a better read for a character, what's going to establish the story and the personality better, all things that are great to keep in mind as you're creating these characters. So some really fantastic work from everyone here. Everyone's making really great progress in their artistic journey. Thank you to everyone who not only is supporting me and the channel through these critiques, I really couldn't keep doing this without that help, but also for being willing to have other folks view it, have it put on display here for the benefit of everyone else is a huge help. You can keep up with me at Bagel Denizen on Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch, and of course we're making new videos every week here on Character Design Forge. You can keep my forge burning over on patreon.com/bageldenizen. Thank you so much for watching, and have fun creating.